Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a building that changed the course of American history. Not the White House, not the Capitol. A one-room schoolhouse with a leaking roof, no glass in the windows, and 60 people crammed inside who just learned, maybe weeks ago, that they were free. Tonight, we're talking about what school was like in the first black communities, and I promise you, this is a story that will make you look at every classroom you've ever sat in a little differently. Because the education you received, the fact that you can read these words, trace it back far enough, and you'll find someone who risked a whipping, a severed finger, or worse, just for the chance to sound out the letters in a borrowed spelling book by candlelight. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Tell me where you're listening and whether you ever had a teacher who changed your life. Someone who saw something in you before you saw it yourself. I'd love to hear those stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull the blankets up. Get comfortable. You're about to earn a different kind of education tonight. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to walk into a classroom for the very first time, knowing that just months earlier, the act of reading could have cost you your life? What was it like to sit beside your own grandmother on a bench, both of you learning the alphabet together? What did the schoolhouse smell like? Was there even a schoolhouse? Or were you learning under a tree, in a shed, in the burned-out shell of a Confederate hospital? Where did the books come from? Who were the teachers? And here's the part that nobody tells you enough. Why were white mobs so terrified of black children, learning to spell that they'd ride out at night and burn the building to the ground? What was it about a 6-year-old sounding out the word freedom that made grown men reach for a torch? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1866, somewhere in the rural South. You're free. You've been free for about a year now, give or take, depending on when the news actually reached your county. You can still feel the phantom weight of the old life in your shoulders, in the way you flinch when a white man's voice gets too loud, in the way your hands instinctively reach for work before the sun is fully up. But something has shifted in you, something urgent and electric, because you heard that down the road, past the crossroads and the old cotton gin. In a building that used to be a church, someone is teaching people to read. Let's be clear about what that sentence means. For your entire life, and your parents' lives, and their parents' lives before them, the ability to read was treated as contraband more dangerous than a loaded pistol. In the decades before the war, nearly every southern state had laws on the books making it illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write. South Carolina passed the first one back in 1740. North Carolina's version specified 39 lashes for any person of color caught learning, and a $200 fine for any white person doing the teaching. Louisiana went further. The penalty for instructing a free black person in Sunday school was $500 for your first offense and death for your second. Let that sink in. Death for teaching someone to read the Bible. And the reasoning behind these laws tells you everything you need to know about the power of literacy. Slaveholders didn't fear reading because they thought enslaved people couldn't do it. They feared it because they knew they could. An enslaved person who could read might encounter the Declaration of Independence and notice the part about all men being created equal. They might read an abolitionist pamphlet. They might forge a travel pass. They might write a letter. They might organize. A North Carolina statute put it plainly, that teaching enslaved people to read and write tends to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion. Translation: if they learn to read, they'll figure out what we're doing to them is wrong, and they'll fight back. So the system invested enormous energy in keeping black people illiterate. Patrollers, those roving bands of white men who policed enslaved people's movements at night, made it their business to confiscate books, beat anyone caught studying, and terrorize anyone who dared to teach. In some places, the punishment for a first offense was a whipping. The second offense meant the cat o' nine tails. The third time, they cut the first joint off your forefinger, your writing finger. Because if the law couldn't stop you from wanting to read, it would take away the hand you'd used to prove you could. And yet people learned anyway. They learned from stolen glances at a master's newspaper. They learned from the white children they played with, trading marbles and fruit for reading lessons behind the barn. They learned from preachers who folded literacy into Sunday sermons, disguising lessons as scripture study. They learned in what some historians call pit schools, secret classrooms held in the woods at night, far from the patrollers' torches, where a handful of enslaved people would huddle around a single candle and a borrowed copy of Noah Webster's spelling book, the famous blue-back speller with its worn blue cover and its systematic march from the alphabet through syllables to sentences. Picture that for a moment. The year is 1850, somewhere in Alabama. It's long past midnight. You've worked a full day in the fields. Your body is screaming for sleep. But instead of collapsing onto your pallet, you've crept out into the dark, navigating by starlight and memory to a clearing deep enough in the trees that no light will be visible from the main road. There are maybe 8 of you. Someone has a pine torch that throws just enough flickering light to read by. Someone else has the speller, its pages soft from so many hands turning them. And in a whisper barely louder than the insects, you sound out the words B-A-K-E-R, Baker, F-R-E-E-D-O-M, freedom. You're learning to read in a country that has made your education a capital crime, and every letter you master is an act of revolution. One man named Lucius Halsey, enslaved in Georgia, managed to acquire a personal library of exactly 5 books by selling rags. 5. 2 spelling books, a dictionary, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and the Bible. With nothing but those 5 books and an iron will, he painstakingly taught himself to read by memorizing individual words, not sentences, not even syllables, one word at a time. Think about that the next time you scroll past 100 articles without reading a single one. This man built his literacy word by word from a library he bought with rags. And the methods of concealment were as creative as they were desperate. Enslaved people practiced writing in the dirt because letters scratched in soil could be scuffed away in a heartbeat if a patroller appeared. Archaeologists at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello found over 200 unidentified writing slates, pencil leads, and writing implements in the quarters where enslaved people lived, evidence that people were practicing their letters in the only privacy available to them, in the dark hours of the night, in the corners of their rooms, where no one could see. Some historians estimate that despite all the laws and punishments, between 5 and 10% of enslaved people achieved some degree of literacy before the war. In Kentucky, one historian found that 20% of runaway slaves could read and 10% could write. These numbers are small, but they represent an extraordinary achievement given the circumstances. Each literate enslaved person was a crack in the wall of a system that had invested everything in keeping that wall intact. Children were among the most creative learners. Enslaved children would trade food, marbles, toys, anything they had, to the white children of the plantation in exchange for reading lessons. Frederick Douglass described trading bread to hungry white neighborhood children, who, in return, gave him something he valued far more: knowledge. He wrote that these children gave him that more valuable bread of knowledge. And the lessons happened in stolen moments, behind barns and in empty fields, in the brief windows between chores when no overseer was watching. There's something profoundly moving about the image of two children, one enslaved and one free, sitting in the dust behind a building, sharing a book. The white child probably didn't understand the full gravity of what they were doing. The black child almost certainly did. And then there was the oral tradition, which deserves its own moment of recognition. Even when written literacy was impossible, black communities maintained an extraordinary tradition of oral education. Spirituals weren't just songs. They were encoded messages, maps, instructions, resistance strategies disguised as religious devotion. The elders told stories that carried history, values, and practical knowledge across generations. Preachers delivered sermons that functioned as lessons in morality, community, and survival. The Sunday gathering, the evening storytelling circle, the call and response tradition that later gave birth to gospel and blues and jazz, all of these were educational institutions in their own right. The slaveholders thought they had cut black people off from knowledge by banning the written word. What they didn't understand was that knowledge doesn't need paper to survive. There's a woman named Susie King Taylor, whose story captures this whole period better than any textbook ever could. She was born enslaved in Georgia in 1848, the eldest of 9 children. When she was 7, her grandmother arranged for her to attend a secret school run by a free black woman named Mrs. Woodhouse in Savannah. The school operated on Bay Lane, between Habersham and Price Streets, about half a mile from her house. She and her brother would walk there every day around 9 o'clock with their books wrapped in paper to prevent the police or white persons from seeing them. They entered one at a time through the gate, through the yard, to the kitchen, which served as the classroom. Mrs. Woodhouse had 25 or 30 students, assisted by her daughter Mary Jane. Think about the choreography of that daily routine, the careful wrapping of the books, the staggered entries through the gate so as not to attract attention, the kitchen disguised as a schoolroom. These weren't children playing school. These were children running an intelligence operation, and the intelligence they were gathering was the English alphabet. When the Civil War came, Taylor escaped to Union lines and became a laundress, nurse, and teacher for the 1st Black Regiment mustered in the Union Army, the 33rd United States Colored Troops. She taught soldiers to read and write. Men who had never held a book in their lives sat with her in the evenings and learned their letters so they could write to families they hadn't seen in years, so they could read orders, so they could sign their names on the muster roll instead of marking an X. After the war, Taylor opened schools for black children and adults during Reconstruction, first in Savannah and then on the Sea Islands. She is one of the only black women to publish a memoir of her wartime experience, and the thread that runs through her entire life, from that secret kitchen school on Bay Lane to the regimental campfire to the post-war classroom, is the same thread that runs through tonight's entire story. The unbreakable connection between literacy and freedom. There's another figure from this period whose story deserves its own breath. Charlotte Forten was a free black woman from a prominent Philadelphia abolitionist family who traveled to the Sea Islands of South Carolina in 1862 to teach formerly enslaved people at Port Royal. This was one of the first large-scale experiments in freedmen's education, sometimes called the Port Royal experiment, and Forten threw herself into it with a passion that burned through her diary entries. She wasn't just teaching reading and writing. She was teaching racial pride. She wrote about talking to her students about Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history that produced an independent nation. They listened very attentively, she wrote. It is well that they should know what one of their color could do for his race. I long to inspire them with courage and ambition and high purpose. Fortin understood something that many of the white northern teachers did not, that education for black students couldn't just be about acquiring skills. It had to be about acquiring a sense of self. It had to counter the centuries of propaganda that had told black people they were nothing by showing them evidence that they were everything. She taught history as resistance, and in doing so, she set a template that black educators would follow for generations. John Berry Meacham is another figure who deserves his moment. When Missouri passed an anti-literacy law in 1847, Meacham had been running a school for black children in St. Louis. Rather than shut down, he moved his entire operation onto a steamboat on the Mississippi River, which was beyond the reach of Missouri state law. He called it the Floating Freedom School. Imagine the audacity of that. The state says you can't teach black children within its borders. Fine. You'll teach them on the river, on a boat, in the middle of the Mississippi, where the law can't touch you. If that isn't the most perfectly American act of creative defiance in the history of education, I don't know what is. And then there was Margaret Crittenden Douglas, a white woman in Norfolk, Virginia, who was arrested, tried, and sentenced to a month in prison for educating free black children. After her release, she wrote a book about her experience, which drew national attention to the anti-literacy laws and their absurdity. Think about that sequence. A woman goes to jail for teaching children to read. She gets out. She writes a book. The book sparks outrage. The law that jailed her becomes evidence in the case for its own abolition. Literacy, in this story, defeats the forces arrayed against it using the very tool those forces tried to suppress, the written word. This is where the story of black schooling begins. Not in 1865 with the Freedmen's Bureau, not with white missionaries from the North arriving with boxes of donated textbooks. It begins in the dark, in secret, at enormous personal risk, driven by a hunger for knowledge that no law could legislate away. An older woman named Charity Bowery, formerly enslaved in North Carolina, later told an interviewer that she'd seen black people gathered under large oaks and in secret places, sitting in the woods with spelling books. Another formerly enslaved man named John Walton kept his blueback speller his whole life and told an interviewer at the age of 87 that he wouldn't take nothing for it. Jenny Proctor, enslaved in Alabama, described how they'd sneak hold of that Webster's old blueback speller and hide it until way in the night, then light a little pine torch and study. They learned it too, she said. These hidden schools, these whispered lessons, these midnight alphabets were the foundation. Everything that came next, every freedmen's school, every black college, every generation of black teachers and doctors and lawyers and writers rests on the shoulders of people who decided that if the price of literacy was a whipping or a severed finger, then they'd pay it. Now fast forward. The war is over. The Confederacy is dust. And across the South, something extraordinary is happening. It's happening so fast and with such force that it catches almost everyone off guard. Black communities are building schools, not asking for them, not waiting for permission, building them with their own hands, their own money, their own sweat. Before the Freedmen's Bureau sets up shop, before the Northern Missionary Societies send their first teachers south, before the federal government allocates a single dollar for black education, formerly enslaved people are pooling their pennies, finding buildings, hiring anyone who can read, and opening schoolhouse doors. In Virginia, within days of Union forces taking Alexandria, black women who had been teaching in secret for years, women like Mary Chase, Jane Crouch, and Annabelle Davis, began teaching openly. They didn't wait for authorization. They didn't wait for funding. They just started. In September 1861, before the war was even half over, a woman named Mary Peake held her first class for formerly enslaved people under a massive oak tree near Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. She started with about 6 students. Within days, she had 50. That tree would later be called the Emancipation Oak, and the ground beneath it would eventually become Hampton University. Peake herself had been born free, had been secretly teaching black children and adults for over a decade, despite Virginia laws that would have imprisoned her for it, and she refused a salary when the American Missionary Association hired her as their first black teacher. She taught until tuberculosis confined her to bed, and even then she kept teaching from her mattress until she died in February 1862. She was 38 years old. Mary Peake's story is remarkable, but here's the thing that the history books too often miss. She wasn't an exception. She was part of a pattern. Across the South, the first teachers in black schools were overwhelmingly black themselves. In Virginia, 16 of the first 24 teachers in black schools were African American. More than a third of all teachers in Virginia's freedmen's schools throughout the entire Reconstruction period were black. And black teachers stayed longer, committed deeper, and taught with a fire that came from personal experience with the system they were fighting against. So let's go back to 1866. You're walking down a dirt road in the rural South, maybe Georgia, maybe Mississippi, maybe the Carolinas, and you're heading to school. You're not a child, or rather, you might be, but the person walking beside you might be your mother. The person ahead of you might be your grandfather. Because one of the most extraordinary things about these first schools is who showed up. Everyone. Children sat next to parents. Teenagers sat next to grandparents. The Freedmen's Bureau reported that school attendance among black students was fully equal to white attendance in northern cities, which is astonishing when you consider that these people had nothing, no savings, no property, no safety net, and the act of sending your child to school meant one less pair of hands in the field, one less day of wages, one less margin against starvation. The demand was so overwhelming that teachers were swamped from the moment they opened the doors. One missionary teacher in Athens, Georgia, described limiting her school to 200 students, only to have a father beg her to let his 2 children in. His words survived in her account. "Do let them come if you please, Mom," he said. "And if you can't teach them even a little, just let them sit and hear what the rest learn. They'll be sure to catch it." She let them in. She let them all in. The hunger was that deep. And it wasn't just during the day. Teachers organized night schools for adults who couldn't leave their work during daylight hours. They organized Sabbath schools on Sundays, industrial schools where women and children learned sewing and household skills. In winter, and in the slow seasons between planting and harvesting, entire families would show up together, fathers and mothers reciting alongside their children. The Freedmen's Bureau reported something that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. That suspension from the privileges of the school was the severest punishment a teacher needed to use. Think about that. These students didn't need to be threatened into attending. Being told you couldn't come to school was the worst thing that could happen to you. So what did the schoolhouse actually look like? Let's step inside. And I use the word schoolhouse generously because in most places there was no schoolhouse. Not at first. The first schools were held in whatever space the community could find. Abandoned churches, private homes, former military hospitals, sheds, barns. In one documented case, a dismantled bomb-proof, which is essentially a military bunker, was pressed into service as a classroom. In the Sea Islands of South Carolina, classes were held in the shade of live oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Across the South, any building with a roof and enough floor space for people to sit became a school. When a community was lucky enough to have an actual building, the conditions were Spartan in ways that would make your eyes water. The Freedmen's Bureau Superintendent of Education for Mississippi filed a report in 1866 noting that not more than 2 of the schoolhouses in his jurisdiction had been properly fitted up with writing desks, even of the most primitive kind. Some had very little accommodation for writing. Most had none at all. You're trying to learn to write and there's no surface to write on. You're balancing your slate on your knee, or scratching letters in the dirt floor, or sharing a single pencil among 15 students. The buildings themselves leaked. They had gaps in the walls that let in wind, rain, and every insect the South had to offer. The floors were packed dirt or rough-hewn planks. Light came from whatever windows existed, which often had no glass, just openings covered with cloth or left open to the elements. In winter, heat came from a single wood stove if the community was fortunate enough to have one, and the children closest to the stove baked while the children furthest away shivered. In summer, the heat was suffocating, the kind of sticky, pressing southern heat that makes your clothes cling and your concentration swim. There was no ventilation beyond the open windows and whatever cross breeze the architecture accidentally provided. And the smell. You'd notice the smell first. Packed dirt and damp wood. The musty funk of too many bodies in too small a space. Tallow candles if lessons ran late. The faint sweetness of pine resin from the walls. In rural areas, the barnyard tang of nearby livestock. And underneath it all, the particular scent of effort, the sweat of people who walked miles to get here, who came straight from fields or kitchens or washboards, who carried the day's labor in their clothes and didn't care because they were here to learn. Now, the books. Here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean heartbreaking in a way that somehow makes the whole thing more impressive. The books, in the beginning, were little better than the buildings. Early schools depended almost entirely on donated books from the north, and what arrived was a grab bag of whatever people could spare. Old textbooks, outdated readers, sometimes books so obsolete they'd been gathering dust in New England attics for a decade. You might get a primer from 1840 that still referred to George Washington as if he'd died recently. You might get a hymnal, 3 copies of a Latin grammar nobody needed, and a single arithmetic book that had to be shared among 40 students. But the book that mattered most, the book that became the backbone of black literacy in this period, was Noah Webster's elementary spelling book, the Blueback Speller. If you've heard the name before, you probably associate it with colonial New England, with powdered wigs and one-room schoolhouses full of white children in the 1780s. But the Blueback Speller had a second life, a secret life, and arguably its most important one, in the hands of black Americans fighting for literacy. The book was genius in its simplicity. It started with the alphabet, moved systematically through vowel and consonant sounds, built up to syllables, then simple words, then complex words, then sentences. It was designed so that a person could essentially teach themselves if they had to, which is exactly what thousands of enslaved people did before the war. Frederick Douglass learned to read with a blueback speller. Booker T. Washington wrote about its near sacred significance in black communities. George Washington Carver knew it. After emancipation, adults and children who couldn't attend school regularly would get hold of a copy and work through it on their own, sounding out letters by firelight. The book cost almost nothing. It fit in a pocket, and it contained everything you needed to crack the code of written English. In the freedmen schools, the blueback speller was often the only book a student had, and it was treated like treasure. Children carried it wrapped in cloth to protect it from rain and dust. Adults slept with it under their pillows. Families who owned a single copy passed it between members, each person taking their turn with the lessons. And the experience of reading it, of actually sounding out words for the first time, carried an emotional weight that's hard to overstate. You have to understand that for these students, every word they decoded was a door opening. Every sentence they read was proof that the slaveholders had been wrong, that the entire ideological foundation of slavery, the lie that black people were intellectually incapable of learning, was exactly that, a lie. There's a moment that captures this reverence perfectly. An 87-year-old former slave named John Walton, decades after emancipation, still kept his blueback speller in his home. When an interviewer asked him about it, he said simply that he'd learned to read and write a little just since freedom, and that they used Webster's old blueback speller, and he still had one in the house, and he wouldn't take nothing for it. Nothing. This man, who had lived through slavery, through the war, through Reconstruction, through the betrayal of Reconstruction, through decades of Jim Crow, had carried a small blue-covered spelling book through all of it. It was more than a book to him. It was a talisman. It was proof that he had claimed something that the system tried to deny him. It was, in the most literal sense, a badge of freedom. Booker T. Washington wrote about the blueback speller with similar reverence. George Washington Carver spoke of it. There's a story, almost too perfect to be true, but documented nonetheless, of a 10-year-old enslaved boy who joined the Union Army as a laborer and came upon a group of black Union soldiers on a battlefield, teaching themselves to read with a blueback speller. Picture that scene. A battlefield, soldiers, and in a quiet moment between engagements, men in uniform huddle around a small book with a blue cover, sounding out words. B-A-T-T-L-E, battle. V-I-C-T-O-R-Y, victory. F-R-E-E-D-O-M, freedom. They are simultaneously fighting a war and learning to read. They are soldiers and students at the same time, and the two roles are not separate. They are fighting for the right to read, and they are reading as an act of fighting. The blueback speller was also a social equalizer in a strange and wonderful way. It didn't care who you were. It didn't care whether you were 5 or 55, whether you'd been enslaved for a day or a lifetime, whether you'd been born in Virginia or Georgia or Mississippi. The lessons started at A and ended at Z, and everyone had to go through them in the same order. There was a democracy to it, a leveling quality that must have been intoxicating for people who had spent their entire lives being told they were less than. In front of the blueback speller, everyone was a beginner. Everyone was equal. Everyone had the same chance. Beyond the speller, some schools eventually received more diverse collections of books. McGuffey readers appeared in some classrooms, with their morality tales and their emphasis on character, truth, and good citizenship. The Bible was universal, serving double duty as religious instruction and reading practice. Teachers created their own materials when commercial textbooks weren't available, writing vocabulary lists on chalkboards, composing sentences that were relevant to their students' lives, inventing exercises that made the lessons immediate and practical. The best teachers understood that a lesson about counting was more engaging if the things being counted were bales of cotton or bushels of corn, items that their students encountered every day. They made the curriculum live in the world their students actually inhabited. Beyond the speller, some schools received copies of the Freedman's Spelling Book, published specifically for formerly enslaved students by the American Tract Society. This book mixed vocabulary lessons with moral instruction, which sounds harmless enough until you look at what it was actually teaching. Alongside the spelling words were lessons in obligation, in gratitude to white Northerners who had fought and died in the war, in industriousness and frugality. There was a not-so-subtle current running through the text that positioned black freedom as a gift from white benefactors, rather than a right that had been stolen and belatedly returned. Some teachers amplified these messages. Others, particularly black teachers, pushed back, using the text as springboards for conversations about self-determination, about building something new, about the difference between being given freedom and claiming it. Let's stay with the classroom for a moment longer, because what happened inside those walls deserves a closer look. Imagine you're a teacher in one of these schools. You're standing in front of maybe 60 students, ranging in age from 5 to 65. You have one textbook, maybe two, a chalkboard if you're fortunate, chalk that you may have paid for yourself, no curriculum guide, no standardized tests, no principal down the hall to consult. You have your own education, your own determination, and the knowledge that every one of these people came here voluntarily, often at great personal cost, because they believe you can give them something that will change their lives. You learn quickly that teaching in a freedmen's school is nothing like teaching anywhere else. The emotional stakes are unlike anything the Northern teachers were prepared for. A woman in your night class breaks down crying when she reads her first complete sentence, because she is 43 years old and she has waited her whole life for this moment. A man who is learning to write his name for the first time holds the pen so tightly his knuckles turn white, and when the letters appear on the slate, he stares at them as if they're a miracle, because to him they are. A child reads the word mother and suddenly understands that the sounds she makes every day when she calls out across the yard have a shape on paper, that her whole world has a written form, and the look on her face is something no teacher's training manual can prepare you for. The emotional weight of these classrooms was immense. Teachers wrote letters back to their organizations in the North describing scenes that moved them to tears. They described students who begged that the work not be interrupted for the necessary summer vacation. Children who cried when school was out because they didn't want to stop learning. Adults who walked miles in the rain without complaint. The American Freedmen's Union Commission noted in 1867 that the eagerness of these students to learn could scarcely be overstated. Schoolhouses were crowded. People were clamoring for more. And out of their poverty, black families made large contributions for the purchase of land, the building of schoolhouses, and the support of teachers. There was also the matter of what happened around the school, because these buildings served functions far beyond education. The schoolhouse was the community center. It was the meeting hall. It was where political organizing happened, where mutual aid societies gathered, where community news was shared, where strategies for dealing with hostile white neighbors were quietly discussed. Churches served similar purposes, and indeed, many schools operated inside churches. The building was more than a classroom. It was the physical embodiment of a community's hope and determination. And that's exactly why attacking it was so effective as a tool of terror. Burning a school didn't just destroy a building. It destroyed a gathering place, a center of gravity, a symbol. The curriculum in these schools was more rigorous than you might expect. Yes, the basics were front and center. Reading, writing, arithmetic, spelling. But many schools went further. Geography, grammar, history. Some taught Greek and Latin. The vision, at least for the educators who understood what was at stake, wasn't to create a population of barely literate laborers who could sign their names on a contract and not much else. It was to produce citizens, people who could read a newspaper and evaluate its claims, people who could write a letter to a congressman, people who could calculate whether a sharecropping arrangement was fair or whether they were being cheated, people who could sit on a jury, hold office, own property, and navigate a world that had been specifically designed to exclude them. And the teaching method itself was a product of its time. Instruction was primarily oral. A teacher would read aloud, and students would repeat what they heard over and over, drilling the words into memory. When they advanced to reading, they'd progress through their textbook page by page, section by section, memorizing each part before moving to the next. Students were grouped not by age, but by ability. So an 8-year-old just starting the alphabet might sit in the same row as a 30-year-old who had secretly learned a few letters before the war. A 60-year-old grandmother might be in the intermediate group, working on her first full sentences, while her 10-year-old granddaughter was already reading paragraphs. The scene was unlike anything you'd see in a northern school or a modern classroom. It was messy and crowded and emotionally charged and absolutely electric with purpose. Let's talk about the teachers. Because the teachers in these schools are some of the most extraordinary and underappreciated figures in American history, and they came from everywhere. First, the black teachers. They were the backbone. In Georgia alone, a quarter of all teachers in freedmen's schools were African American. Many were native Southerners who had been secretly literate for years, sometimes decades, and who stepped into public teaching the moment the law no longer threatened them with violence for doing so. Others were northern-born black men and women who traveled south specifically to teach, drawn by a commitment to their people that went beyond employment. They had attended schools like Oberlin College in Ohio, Wilberforce University, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, institutions that had educated free black students before the war. And they came south knowing exactly what they were walking into. The northern black teachers tended to stay longer and dig in deeper than their white counterparts. They understood, at a cellular level, what was at stake. They weren't doing charity work. They were doing liberation work. They organized themselves into teacher associations, experimented with curricula, debated pedagogy, wrote reports, and pushed back against any attempt to water down the education they were providing. When the Freedmen's Bureau or the missionary societies tried to limit the curriculum to basic literacy and industrial skills, black teachers argued for a full classical education. Their students deserved the same intellectual rigor that white students received, and they were willing to fight for it. Then there were the northern white teachers. These were mostly women, many from New England, many from deeply religious backgrounds. They came south through organizations like the American Missionary Association, the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, and various Quaker groups. They were educated. Many were college graduates from institutions like Dartmouth, Yale, Mount Holyoke, and Oberlin, and they arrived with a mix of genuine idealism and sometimes a paternalism that complicated their work. They believed in education as a tool for uplift, but some of them also carried assumptions about what black students could achieve, about the pace at which they should learn, about the proper boundaries of their ambition. The white teachers also bore the brunt of social persecution from the white Southern community. Being a nigger teacher, as the locals called it, with deliberate contempt, made you a pariah. White families refused to rent rooms to freedmen's teachers. Boarding houses turned them away. Neighbors subjected them to every kind of taunt, ridicule, and social exclusion the Southern vocabulary could furnish. In several cases, schoolhouses where white teachers worked were burned to the ground. Some teachers were physically assaulted. Others received death threats, and many of them, worn down by the isolation and the hostility, left after a single term. The enthusiasm of the early years faded, and by the late 1860s, the number of white Northern teachers was declining steadily. Black teachers, who had nowhere else to go and no intention of giving up, filled the gaps and kept the schools alive. A few white Southerners also taught in freedmen's schools, though this was rarer and even more dangerous. In Georgia, nearly 50 white Georgians served as teachers. They were regarded as traitors to their race by their neighbors, and the courage it took to walk into a black school in a Southern town and teach, knowing that your own community viewed you with a hatred usually reserved for enemy combatants, is something that deserves more recognition than it typically gets. And then there was a category of teacher that defies easy classification: the community teacher. This was often an older person, someone who had been secretly literate before the war, who simply began teaching their neighbors. No formal training, no organizational affiliation, no salary, just a person with knowledge and a willingness to share it. These community teachers existed in almost every black settlement, and they were the first line of education for many families. David B. Simons in Sharpsburg, Maryland, a literate black man and church trustee, likely taught children and adults in his town before any outside help arrived. Stories like his repeated themselves across the South, in every state, in communities large and small. The teacher was already there. The school just hadn't been named yet. There's one more category of educator that doesn't get enough attention: the students who became teachers. In the freedmen's schools, the boundary between student and teacher was porous in a way that no modern educational system would recognize. A student who mastered reading in the morning might be asked to help a newer student with their letters in the afternoon. Older children routinely tutored younger ones. Adults who learned to read in night school taught their family members at home, spreading the lessons outward in ripples. This cascade effect meant that the impact of a single teacher was multiplied many times over. One teacher could reach 60 students directly. Those 60 students could reach their families, their neighbors, their friends. Knowledge moved through the community like water through root systems, finding every crack, filling every space. Some of the most effective educators in these communities were teenagers. A 15-year-old girl who had been among the first students in a new school might, within a year, be teaching the younger children, while the formal teacher worked with the advanced students. These informal teaching roles gave young people a sense of purpose and authority they had never been allowed to experience under slavery. They weren't just learning, they were leading. And the experience of standing before a group of eager faces and helping them learn their letters planted seeds that would grow into teaching careers, into leadership roles, into lifelong commitments to education. The normal schools, teacher training institutions specifically designed to prepare educators for the growing number of black schools, began springing up across the South in the late 1860s and 1870s. Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, founded in 1868 on the ground where Mary Peake once taught under an oak tree, was one of the most influential. It trained black teachers not just in academic subjects, but in teaching methods, classroom management, and the philosophy of education. Its graduates fanned out across the South, carrying their training into communities that desperately needed them. When a community wrote to the Bureau or a missionary society requesting a teacher, and a Hampton graduate showed up at their door, it was like receiving a precision instrument. These teachers knew how to teach. They understood pedagogy. They brought structure, method, and professional skill to classrooms that had been running on passion and improvisation. But the normal schools also became battlegrounds in the ongoing debate about what black education should look like. Hampton, under the influence of its white founder Samuel Chapman Armstrong, emphasized industrial education and moral training alongside academics. Booker T. Washington, Hampton's most famous graduate, carried this philosophy to Tuskegee and made it the centerpiece of his educational vision. But other black educators, particularly those aligned with W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that black students deserved access to the same liberal arts education that white universities offered. The talented 10th, Du Bois argued, the top tier of black scholars and thinkers, needed the kind of rigorous classical education that would equip them to lead their communities. Industrial training was valuable, but it wasn't sufficient. Black people needed poets and philosophers as well as carpenters and farmers. This debate played out in classrooms and boardrooms and editorial pages for decades, and it never fully resolved. In practice, most schools offered some combination of both approaches. A student might learn Latin grammar in the morning and blacksmithing in the afternoon. A girl might study geography and then practice dressmaking. The pragmatism of black communities, their insistence on educating the whole person for the whole range of challenges they'd face, meant that the theoretical debate between Du Bois and Washington was often less important on the ground than it appeared in print. Parents didn't care whether their children's education was classified as industrial or classical. They cared that their children could read a contract, balance a ledger, write a letter to a senator, build a fence, and hold their heads high. Whatever combination of skills accomplished, that was the right curriculum, and black communities adjusted their schools accordingly. Now let's talk about what it cost to keep a school open, because the economics of black education in this period tell a story of double taxation that is as infuriating as it is inspiring. Black communities paid for their schools out of their own pockets. They paid monthly tuition fees. They raised money for teachers' room and board. They purchased lots for schoolhouses. They donated materials and labor to build them. They held fundraisers, passed collection plates at church, and scraped together whatever they could from wages that barely covered their own survival. In Georgia, freedmen, who were paying to build and maintain their own schools, were simultaneously required to pay state school taxes that funded only white schools. Let me say that again, because I want it to settle in your bones. Black Georgians were taxed to pay for white children's education while receiving nothing in return. And then they dug into their own near-empty pockets to fund schools for their own children on top of that. The historian James Anderson called this double taxation, and it's one of those phrases that sounds academic until you think about what it actually meant in practice. It meant a sharecropper who was already giving half his crop to a white landowner was also paying taxes he'd never benefit from, and then donating money to a school fund so his daughter could learn to read. It meant a washerwoman who charged pennies for laundering white families' sheets was also contributing to a building fund for a one-room schoolhouse she might never set foot in because she was too old, too tired, and too busy earning a living. But her granddaughter would sit in that room, and that was enough. The Freedmen's Bureau helped, but its help was always limited and always temporary. Congress established the Bureau in March 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people with a range of needs: food, clothing, labor contracts, and education. The Bureau partnered with northern missionary societies and local black communities to place teachers and provide some funding for schools. By 1870, Bureau efforts had helped enroll roughly 250,000 students in freedmen's schools across the South. But the Bureau was chronically underfunded, perpetually understaffed, and politically vulnerable. It couldn't build enough schools to meet demand. It couldn't protect the schools it did build from arson and violence. And in 1872, when Congress failed to renew its funding, the Bureau closed its doors, leaving black communities to carry the full weight of their children's education on their own backs. The way the Freedmen's Bureau operated tells you a lot about the gap between intention and reality. The Bureau didn't build most of the schools from scratch. It worked with northern benevolent organizations and local black communities in a three-way partnership that was idealistic in theory and chaotic in practice. The northern organizations, groups like the American Missionary Association, the American Freedmen's Union Commission, and various Quaker and Baptist societies, recruited and paid teachers. The Bureau assigned those teachers to schools and provided them with transportation. The local black community was expected to contribute room and board for the teacher and a building to house the school. On paper, this was a model of cooperative self-help. In practice, it meant that the poorest people in the country were shouldering a significant share of the cost of their own education, while also paying taxes that funded white schools they could never attend. The Bureau's own agents saw the contradictions clearly. In Louisiana, one agent named Aaron Walker reported in 1865 that he had helped establish 3 schools in Shreveport and 2 in Natchitoches, each with over 40 students. But he also noted that in the central Louisiana town of Alexandria, the number of potential students could fill at least 2 schools, but there was no building or even room in which to house them. Another agent, George Ruby, who would later become a prominent black political leader in Texas, described how he had to pay rent for school buildings because no one would donate space, and the community's poverty made every expense a crisis. The Bureau's school reports from this period read like dispatches from the front lines of an underfunded war. Teachers filled out monthly forms detailing their enrollment numbers, attendance rates, subjects taught, and the condition of their facilities. Most missionary groups required narrative reports on top of the forms. Reading these reports today, you encounter the same themes over and over: overwhelming demand, inadequate resources, hostile neighbors, crumbling buildings, and students whose eagerness to learn was the one thing that never faltered. A teacher in the Chimborazo School in Richmond, one of the earliest black schools in Virginia, opened on the site where a Confederate hospital had operated just weeks before, recorded students ranging in age from 4 to 29. 4 to 29. A preschooler and a grown adult learning to read in the same room, in a building that had recently been used to patch up Confederate soldiers. If that doesn't capture the surreal, complicated, beautiful mess of Reconstruction education, nothing does. The Bureau also did something that had long-term consequences for black education. It created the infrastructure for what would eventually become public school systems in states that had never had them. Before the Civil War, most of the South had no public education to speak of for anyone. The planter class educated its children privately. Poor whites were mostly illiterate. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning. The idea of universal, tax-funded public schooling was essentially a Reconstruction innovation, and black politicians played a critical role in writing it into state constitutions. During the constitutional conventions of 1867 and 1868, black delegates pushed for provisions requiring the establishment of public school systems open to all children. They succeeded, and though the systems that resulted were immediately segregated and unequally funded, the principle of public education itself, the idea that every child deserves a school, was established in Southern law for the first time, largely because black citizens demanded it. Here's the irony that rarely gets mentioned. The people who had been most systematically denied education were the ones who fought hardest for universal public schooling. The formerly enslaved didn't just want schools for their own children. They wanted a system of education that would serve everyone. Historian James Anderson argues that freed slaves were the first Southerners to campaign for universal, state-supported public education. The very concept of public school in the American South owes its existence, in significant part, to people who had been legally classified as property just a few years earlier. That's not just history, that's poetry. Meanwhile, the missionary societies that had been sending teachers south began to retrench. They concentrated their resources in larger cities and shifted their focus to training teachers, reasoning that the best long-term investment was preparing black educators who could sustain the schools without outside help. It was sound logic, but in the short term, it left rural communities even more isolated. The teachers from New England were going home. The Federal Bureau was shutting down. And the state governments that were supposed to step in and provide public education had no interest in funding black schools at anything close to parity with white ones. The foundation of black education was being built not on government support, but on the sheer, unrelenting determination of communities that had nothing and gave everything. Let me bring you into one of these schools, because the experience of being a student deserves its own attention. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because there's work to do before school, and the walk is long, maybe 2 miles, maybe 5. There's no school bus, there's no parent dropping you off in a wagon unless you're lucky. You walk on dirt roads that are either dusty or muddy, depending on the season, past cotton fields that still carry the memory of a life you'd rather forget, past the property of white landowners who may or may not approve of what you're doing. Some mornings you walk in a loose group with other children from your settlement, and there's a giddiness to it, a lightness that comes from the simple act of walking somewhere of your own choosing. Under slavery, your movements were controlled. You needed a pass to leave the plantation. You could be stopped, questioned, beaten for being in the wrong place. Now you're walking down a public road with a book in your hand, and nobody can stop you. Nobody can ask where you're going. Nobody can send you back. The walk to school is its own kind of freedom, and some mornings you almost want to take the long way just to feel it longer. Other mornings, when the weather is foul or the road is flooded, or you pass a group of white men who stare too long and say nothing, the walk feels like a gauntlet, a reminder that freedom is something you have to claim every single day, step by step, in the face of people who wish you didn't have it. You carry your book, if you have one, wrapped in paper or cloth to protect it from the elements, and also to hide it from anyone who might take offense at the sight of a black child with a book. You arrive at the school, which might be a whitewashed cabin, or a church with the pews pushed aside, or just a clearing under a tree. The room is already filling up. There's your friend who picks cotton on the same land you do. There's the old man from the edge of town who everybody calls uncle, who fought in the war and came back determined to learn his letters before he died. There's the teacher's daughter, who's already the best reader in the class and doesn't let anyone forget it. There's the baby, brought by her mother, because there's nobody at home to watch her, sleeping in a basket in the corner while her mother practices her penmanship. The teacher calls for order. She's young, maybe 22, maybe 25. She graduated from one of the new normal schools that are training black teachers, and she moved here from a city 50 miles away because this community wrote to the bureau asking for someone who could teach. She boards with a local family, sleeping in a room barely bigger than a closet, eating whatever they eat, which isn't much. She earns almost nothing, but she carries herself with an authority that fills the room. And when she picks up the blue back speller and begins the day's lesson, every eye in the room is on her. The morning starts with recitation. The youngest students, the ones still learning their letters, gather at the front, a BC. They chant it together, their voices overlapping, some strong, some barely audible. The teacher points to each letter on a board she chalked that morning. She calls on individual students. Sound it out. What does that letter say? What sound does it make? Put it together. B-A-K-E-R. Baker. Good. Next word. The process is slow, repetitive, and beautiful. You're watching people who were born into a system that told them their minds were incapable of learning. Prove that system wrong with every syllable they pronounce. The intermediate students work on reading passages. They've mastered the alphabet and the basic sounds. Now they're working through sentences, reading aloud from whatever textbook the school has, repeating passages until the words flow smooth. The advanced students, a smaller group, are working on writing. They practice forming letters on slates, copying words from the board, attempting to compose their own sentences. Some of them are also doing arithmetic, learning to add and subtract and multiply, skills that have immediate practical value in a world where white landowners are eager to cheat you at the cotton gin. The older students, the adults, attend with an intensity that's different from the children's. The children have energy and restlessness, and the occasional tendency to poke each other when the teacher isn't looking. The adults are still, focused. They sit with their hands folded and their eyes fixed on the teacher as if she's speaking directly to their souls. Because for them, this isn't just education, it's reclamation. Every word they read is something that was stolen from them being given back. Every sentence they write is proof that the people who called them things, who counted them as fractions, who sold their children and whipped them for wanting to read, were wrong. The adults don't fidget. They don't complain about the heat or the crowded room. They're here for something bigger than comfort. The midday break, if there is one, is brief. Some students brought food, wrapped in cloth, cornbread mostly, maybe some sweet potato, maybe a little salt pork if things were good. Others eat nothing and go right back to studying. Water comes from a well or a nearby creek, carried in a shared bucket. There's no cafeteria, no lunch program, no one handing you a tray, just whatever you brought or went without. Some schools had additional features that speak to the community's ingenuity. Where buildings were available, teachers hung maps on the walls, tacked up alphabet cards, and created visual aids from whatever they could find. In schools that had no books at all, teachers wrote lessons on boards and students copied them onto slates, erasing and rewriting until the slate was smooth and grey. In some communities, a single newspaper was shared among families, with literate members reading aloud to those who couldn't yet decipher the words. The newspaper became a classroom of its own, a portal to the wider world. What was Congress doing? What were the prices at market? What was happening in other states? For people who had spent their lives confined to a single plantation, the simple act of reading about events in distant cities was intoxicating. Music, too, played a role in these schools that's easy to overlook. Many freedmen's schools opened and closed each day with singing, a practice that had roots in the old spiritual tradition. But now the songs took on new dimensions. Alongside the hymns, teachers introduced patriotic songs, educational songs, songs about the alphabet and arithmetic. Students composed their own verses about learning and freedom, blending the musical traditions they'd brought through slavery with the new possibilities that literacy opened up. The singing wasn't just recreational, it was pedagogical. Rhythm and melody made lessons stick in ways that rote memorization alone couldn't match. And the communal act of singing bound the school together as something more than a collection of individuals learning separate skills. It made them a chorus. It made them a community. And there were the smaller moments, the ones that don't make it into the history books, but that anyone who's ever been in a classroom would recognize. A child helping another child sound out a word. A grandmother beaming when her grandson reads a passage without stumbling. The quiet competition between students who pushed each other to learn faster, read more, write neater. The laughter when someone mispronounced a word in a spectacularly creative way. The teacher's gentle correction, offered not as criticism, but as invitation. Come on now, try it again. You almost had it. The warmth of a room full of people who are all engaged in the same extraordinary act. The act of becoming literate in a country that tried to make their literacy impossible. As the weeks and months passed, you'd notice changes in the school and in yourself. The student who struggled with the alphabet in September is reading words by December. The night school, students who came in exhausted and barely able to keep their eyes open in October are arriving in January with energy, bringing questions, asking the teacher to explain things they heard at church or read on a posted notice in town. The school has developed its own personality, its own rhythms. There are the students who always arrive first, the ones who linger after class, the ones who bring their younger siblings and try to teach them during the midday break. There's the social dimension too. The school is the only place in the community where people from different plantations, different farms, different neighborhoods come together regularly. Before the war, enslaved people's movements were tightly controlled. You knew the people on your own plantation, and maybe a few from neighboring ones. The school breaks down those barriers. It creates a community that didn't exist before, connections between families that will last for decades, networks that will sustain political organizing, economic cooperation, and mutual support long after the formal school day ends. The teacher becomes a central figure in community life, a position that carries weight and responsibility far beyond the classroom. Parents come to her with questions about contracts, about legal rights, about how to register to vote. She becomes an advisor, a counselor, a translator between the community and the systems of power that surround it. In some towns, the teacher is the most educated person the community has ever known, and her presence raises the aspirations of everyone around her. If she can learn all that, parents think, my child can too. The teacher doesn't just teach skills, she teaches possibility. The children, meanwhile, are absorbing more than the formal curriculum. They're learning what it means to be part of an institution. They're learning to raise their hands, to wait their turn, to listen when someone else is speaking, to take correction gracefully, to be proud of their achievements. These are skills that seem mundane until you remember that many of these children's parents were never allowed to assert themselves in any public setting without risking punishment. The school is teaching a new way of being in the world, one where black voices are not silenced, where black minds are not dismissed, where black children are treated as people with potential rather than problems to be managed. And the pride is everywhere. It's in the way a child holds up her slate to show her mother the letters she's written. It's in the way a grandmother straightens her dress before walking into the schoolroom, because this place deserves respect. It's in the way a father saves his best pair of shoes for the Sunday when the school holds its public examination, an event where students demonstrate what they've learned to the whole community. These examinations are part showcase, part celebration, part defiant declaration. Look at what our children can do. Look at what we built. Look at what you said was impossible. And watch our 6-year-old prove you wrong by reading a paragraph about George Washington. The public examinations were events that the whole community attended, and they carried enormous symbolic weight. Students would stand before an audience of parents, community elders, teachers, and sometimes outside visitors, and recite passages, solve arithmetic problems, read aloud, and answer questions. For the students, it was a test of everything they'd learned. For the community, it was evidence of progress, proof that the investment of time and money and risk was paying off. For the white observers who occasionally attended, whether sympathetically or with hostile curiosity, it was a confrontation with the reality that black children could learn, and learn well, given the chance. The examinations made the invisible visible. They turned the private miracle of learning into a public declaration. There were also practical lessons that went beyond the standard curriculum. Many teachers taught their students about labor contracts because in the sharecropping system, the ability to read a contract was the difference between survival and exploitation. White landowners routinely structured contracts to cheat illiterate sharecroppers, claiming larger shares of the crop than they were entitled to, adding hidden costs and adjusting numbers at the end of the season. A black farmer who could read his own contract and do his own arithmetic was infinitely harder to cheat. Some teachers devoted specific lessons to contract reading, walking students through the legal language, explaining what each clause meant, teaching them to calculate their fair share. This was education as self-defense, knowledge as armor, and it had immediate, tangible consequences for families' economic survival. In the afternoon, the curriculum might shift. Geography. Where are we in the world? What does the map look like? Some of these students have never been more than 10 miles from where they were born. The idea that there are whole countries across an ocean, that the world extends beyond the county line, is revelatory. History. But whose history? This is where the most courageous teachers walked a tightrope. The available textbooks told a version of American history that either ignored black people entirely or presented them as grateful recipients of white benevolence. The Freedman's Spelling Book carried stories about white soldiers dying to set black people free, without mentioning that nearly 200,000 black soldiers had also served. The best teachers supplemented these texts with their own knowledge, telling stories the books left out, stories of resistance, of ingenuity, of a heritage that stretched back to Africa and forward into whatever future their students were going to build. And then, when the light starts to fade, because there's no electricity and kerosene is expensive, the day ends. Students gather their things. The walk home is long. But tonight, for the adults who couldn't attend during the day, the school opens again. Night school. The same teacher, already exhausted from a full day of instruction, lights a candle or a pine torch and teachers a second shift. Grown men and women who spent the day laboring in fields or kitchens or tanneries file in and take their seats. The room is dimmer now, the faces half in shadow. The teacher's voice is a little hoarse, but the hunger is the same. The hunger is always the same. The night school had its own atmosphere, distinct from the day sessions. The light was different, obviously, flickering and uneven, casting long shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more intimate. The students were different too. During the day, the room held a mix of ages, but the energy skewed young, children squirming on benches, whispering to each other, fidgeting with their slates. At night, the room belonged to the adults. They came in work clothes, still carrying the smell of the fields or the kitchen or the laundry. Their hands were rough. Their backs ached. Some of them had walked miles after a full day's labor, and you could see the exhaustion in their faces. But you could also see something else, something that the exhaustion couldn't touch. A kind of fierce, quiet determination that filled the room like heat from a stove. These men and women had spent decades being told they were incapable of learning. Every night they showed up to class was a rebuttal. Every word they read aloud was an answer to every slaveholder who had ever said the words can't learn, won't learn, doesn't need to learn. But the day school and the night school weren't the only forms of education happening in these communities. There were also the Sabbath schools, held on Sundays in churches that served double or triple duty as houses of worship, community meeting halls, and classrooms. Sabbath schools had existed during slavery as a grey area in the anti-literacy laws because some slaveholders permitted Bible instruction. After the war, they expanded dramatically, becoming one of the most widespread means of education for adults who couldn't attend regular classes. The Sunday session might run 2 or 3 hours, and the curriculum mixed scripture reading with basic literacy and arithmetic. For many adults, Sunday school was the only schooling they could access, and they treated it with a seriousness that would put most modern congregations to shame. There were also the industrial schools, typically attended by women and older girls, where the curriculum focused on sewing, cooking, housekeeping skills, and basic domestic economy. These schools are sometimes dismissed as reinforcing traditional gender roles, and there's validity to that critique. But in their historical context, they also served a practical purpose. Women who could sew, cook, and manage a household budget had marketable skills that could generate income. A woman who could sew well, enough to do alterations and custom work, could earn her own money. And in a world where economic independence was the difference between freedom and a return to servitude in all but name, practical skills mattered enormously. The best industrial schools combined these practical skills with academic instruction, teaching reading and writing alongside needlework and cooking, ensuring that their students left with both the means to earn a living and the tools to navigate the legal and political world. The whole system of Friedman's education was, in a way, a vast experiment in what happens when a people long denied knowledge are suddenly given access to it, and the results were extraordinary. The Freedmen's Bureau reported that by 1870, over 250,000 students were enrolled in schools across the South. That number represented only a fraction of the total demand. For every child who had a seat in a schoolhouse, there were others who couldn't attend because the school was too far, or too full, or because their families needed them in the fields. But the pace of learning among those who did attend was remarkable. Teachers consistently reported that their students advanced rapidly, often outpacing expectations. People who had never seen a written word were reading sentences within months. Adults who had been told their whole lives that they were incapable of learning were mastering arithmetic and geography and grammar with a speed that astonished their teachers and infuriated their critics. The speed of learning made a political point that no speech could have made more effectively. Every black child who learned to read was a living refutation of the ideology that had sustained slavery for centuries. The slaveholders had built their entire system on the premise that black people were intellectually inferior, that they needed white guidance and control because they were incapable of governing themselves. The schoolhouse demolished that premise, one student at a time, and that's why the schoolhouse was so dangerous to the people who wanted to maintain the old order. It wasn't just a building. It was proof that everything they believed and everything they'd built their wealth and power on was a lie. Here's where the story turns darker, because you can't talk about black education in this period without talking about the people who tried to destroy it. From the very beginning, freedmen's schools were targets. White Southerners saw black education as a direct threat to the social order they were desperate to maintain. An illiterate black population could be controlled, exploited, cheated, and kept in a position barely distinguishable from slavery. A literate black population could read contracts, understand their rights, vote with knowledge, organize politically, and demand a seat at every table from which they'd been excluded. Schools were where all of that began, and for that reason, they were hated. The violence started almost immediately. During 3 days of racial terror in Memphis in May 1866, white mobs destroyed hundreds of structures in the black community, including freedmen's schools. At least 46 black people died, most of them Union veterans. Just 2 months later, in New Orleans, a white mob attacked attendees of a black suffrage convention, killing 37 black people and 3 white allies. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the opening salvos of a sustained campaign of terror that would accelerate as the Ku Klux Klan grew in size and ambition. The Klan made schools a primary target. Research has documented at least 631 attacks on black schoolhouses during Reconstruction alone. And that number almost certainly undercounts the actual toll, because the Freedmen's Bureau couldn't even catalog all the schools in operation, let alone track every attack. Most of the damage came from clandestine arson, schoolhouses torched in the dark by men who rode out at night and disappeared before dawn. But there were also mob actions in broad daylight, where Southerners defaced school buildings with tar and paint, ransacked furnishings, and left threatening messages. In Paris, Texas, a group of white girls broke down the door of a freedmen's school, defecated on the desks, and left a cruel note. There were instances of passers-by taking gunshots at school buildings or at the students inside. The Klan whipped teachers. They burned schoolhouses, sometimes the same night they were built. They sent threatening letters. They rode to teachers' homes after dark, fired guns through the windows, and left notices promising worse if the teaching didn't stop. One Freedmen's Bureau report noted that in some Mississippi counties, no schools remained at all because the Klan had destroyed every single one. The message was clear. Black children will not learn, and if anyone tries to teach them, they'll pay for it. The effect was devastating, but not permanent, because black communities rebuilt. Again and again and again. A school would burn, and within weeks, sometimes days, the community would find another building, another space, another way to keep the lessons going. They moved schools into churches. They moved them into homes. They moved them into the woods. If a building burned, they built another one. If a teacher was driven off, they found another one. The Klan could burn the schoolhouse, but they couldn't burn the hunger. That was the one thing they never figured out how to destroy. The principal of one school, Emma Coy of the Emerson Institute, described the aftermath of an arson attack in words that carried the weight of the entire era. Emerson Institute is lying in ruins, she wrote, and you can hear in those 7 words the exhaustion and the grief, and also, underneath it, the refusal to stop, because the Institute was rebuilt, but the violence wasn't limited to arson. Teachers were singled out for especially cruel treatment. White teachers from the North were harassed, threatened, and in some cases physically attacked. The label "nigger teacher" followed them everywhere, shouted from porches, scrawled on fences, muttered in general stores where they tried to buy supplies. Southern white communities treated these teachers as race traitors, collaborators in an effort to upend the natural order. One account from the period described a teacher whose boarding house was repeatedly vandalized, whose mail was intercepted, whose landlord was threatened until he evicted her. She moved 3 times in 1 year. She kept teaching. Black teachers faced different but equally severe dangers. Because they lived within the communities they served, they couldn't retreat to a northern hometown when things got dangerous. They were visible. They were known. And in a system built on keeping black people subordinate, a black teacher represented an intolerable challenge to the hierarchy. There are records of black teachers being whipped, shot at, driven from their homes, and warned that if they didn't stop teaching, they and their families would face consequences. Some were forced to hold classes in secret, a grim echo of the pre-war pit schools. The old patterns hadn't died with slavery. They'd just changed their clothes. The financial terrorism was subtler but equally effective. White landlords refused to rent space to black schools. White employers threatened to fire sharecroppers whose children attended school instead of working in the fields. In the Louisiana Freedmen's Bureau, a tax system was created requiring all residents to pay a 5% tax to support freedmen's schools. But white residents protested so vigorously that the system was changed so that only black residents paid the tax. The people who could least afford it were made to carry the entire burden. It was exploitation dressed up as policy, and it worked. In community after community, the combination of physical violence, economic pressure, and political hostility forced schools to close, teachers to flee, and children to return to the fields. And yet the schools kept coming back. Every time a community lost a school, they found a way to rebuild. Sometimes it took weeks. Sometimes it took months. But the schools always returned, because the people who built them understood something that their oppressors didn't. You can burn a building, but you can't unlearn a letter. You can terrorize a teacher, but you can't erase the lesson she already taught. The knowledge was already out there, spreading from mind to mind, parent to child, friend to friend, in ways that no amount of violence could stop. The federal response was mixed at best. President Grant pushed Congress to investigate Klan violence, and the resulting Joint Select Committee took testimony from freed people across the South, producing a 13-volume report on the tactics the Klan used to derail democracy. Congress passed the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, making it a crime to interfere with registration, voting, and the rights of citizens. Grant even suspended habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties and sent in cavalry to round up suspected Klan members. Some were prosecuted. Many received light sentences. Many more were never caught. The Klan's first incarnation eventually collapsed under federal pressure, but the damage was done, and the white supremacist infrastructure that replaced it was, in many ways, more effective because it operated through law rather than through midnight raids. There's a detail that captures the spirit of this whole era better than any statistic. In several communities, when a school was destroyed by arson, the community didn't just rebuild in the same spot. They built the new school bigger. Not out of defiance, though defiance was certainly part of it, but because by the time the old school burned, there were more students waiting to get in than the old building could hold. The arsonists thought they were sending a message of destruction. The community heard a different message. We need more space. So they built more space. And they kept building until the people with the torches got tired of burning, or got arrested, or simply lost the stomach for fighting against something that clearly wasn't going to stop. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, a school called Howard School was established in a former Confederate medical facility in 1866 by Reverend E.O. Tade, a black minister. The school was named after General O.O. Howard, who directed the Freedmen's Bureau. Almost immediately, the school faced threats. The building was inadequate. There were constant location changes. White opposition was relentless. But the black community's commitment kept the school alive. By 1869, daily attendance had reached 855 students. The student body had grown so fast that the school needed a new, larger building. By 1883, Howard had implemented a high school curriculum, one of the first available to black students in the region. A Fellows School that started in a repurposed enemy hospital became one of the most important educational institutions in Tennessee. That's not just resilience, that's alchemy. Taking the literal infrastructure of the Confederacy and turning it into the infrastructure of black education. On Roanoke Island in North Carolina, a freedmen's colony formed in 1862 after Union forces captured the island. The military classified over 200 black laborers there as contraband to justify not returning them to enslavers. A woman named Martha Culling, formerly enslaved, opened the first school in the colony. It served 120 students a day. As more people arrived, the colony expanded, and the commitment to education expanded with it. By 1863, 6 black schools were operating on the island, with more than 1,200 students between children and adults. Eventually, 8 schools were running, on an island that most of the country had never heard of. 1,200 students, on an island, in the middle of a war, while the people teaching and learning didn't know whether they'd be free next week or sold back into bondage. The word courage doesn't do it justice. In Selma, Alabama, the story followed a pattern that repeated itself across the South. The freed people of Selma turned to the Freedmen's Bureau in late 1865 for help establishing a school. The Bureau and the community managed to open the first black school in the basement of a Baptist church in 1866. But opposition from the white congregation forced them to abandon it. They didn't give up. They solicited support from the American Missionary Association, whose largest donor, Jabez Burrell, contributed $10,000 for a new building. The Burrell Academy opened in 1869 as the first black public school in Selma and one of the oldest in Alabama. It took 3 years, 2 different locations, constant opposition, and the generosity of a donor hundreds of miles away. But the school opened. It always opened. These stories, multiplied by thousands across every southern state, paint a picture of a movement that was unstoppable, not because it was powerful in any conventional sense, but because it was fueled by something more durable than money or political influence. It was fueled by a belief so deep that it survived whippings, survived fire, survived legislation, survived terrorism, and survived poverty. The belief was simple. My child will learn. My child will read. My child will know things I was never allowed to know. And no one, no law, no mob, no torch will stop that from happening. That's the engine that drove everything. It's the engine that's still running. Let's move forward a few years, into the 1870s, and the long shadow of what comes after Reconstruction's promises begin to crumble. The federal troops withdraw. The Freedmen's Bureau closes. White Democrats reclaim state governments across the South. And the system of public education that Reconstruction had begun to build, a system that black politicians had fought to include in state constitutions, a system that was supposed to serve all children regardless of race, begins to tilt sharply against black students. The states created dual systems, one for white children, one for black children, separate and supposedly equal, though the inequality was immediate, obvious, and entirely deliberate. White schools got new buildings, qualified teachers, current textbooks, and adequate funding. Black schools got whatever was left over, which in many cases was almost nothing. In some states, black schools operated for only 4 months a year, compared to 8 or 9 for white schools. Teachers in black schools earned lower salaries regardless of their qualifications. Buildings were neglected. Resources were diverted. The taxes that black families paid continued to fund white education, while their own children's schools starved. By the turn of the century, the spending gap was staggering. In North Carolina, in 1915, the state spent $2.30 per black student, compared to $7.40 per white student, and nearly $30 per student nationally. In majority black Mississippi, the economic valuation of white schools was more than 13 times that of black schools. Per student, 13 to 1. This wasn't separate but equal. This was systematic theft, an entire generation's educational potential sacrificed to maintain the fiction of white supremacy. And here's where the story circles back to its beginning, to the principle that has run like a thread through every chapter of black education in America. When the system refused to provide, black communities provided for themselves. This was the world that black schools inhabited for decades after Reconstruction ended. Underfunded, understaffed, under-equipped, operating in buildings that white communities wouldn't have used for storage, using textbooks so outdated they were practically historical documents, paying teachers salaries so low that many had to take second jobs just to eat. And yet, somehow, against every material disadvantage, these schools produced graduates. They produced readers and writers and thinkers. They produced people who went on to build businesses, serve in the military, become doctors and lawyers and ministers and educators themselves, carrying the torch forward. The black teachers who held these schools together during the long decades of Jim Crow deserve a chapter in the American story that they've never properly received. They worked for almost nothing. They taught with almost nothing. They were subjected to scrutiny and interference from white school boards who held their funding hostage and their curricula under surveillance. And yet they created something remarkable, a tradition of pedagogical excellence that was specifically, intentionally, passionately aimed at proving that black children could learn anything, achieve anything, become anything. The classrooms might have been crumbling. The books might have been decades old, but the teaching was ferocious. These teachers understood something that the architects of segregation never grasped. The quality of education doesn't ultimately depend on the building or the budget. It depends on the fire in the teacher's heart and the hunger in the student's mind. You can starve a school of resources, but you can't starve it of purpose if the people inside it refuse to let the flame go out. and for generation after generation, black teachers refused. They kept the flame burning through the darkest years, through the lynchings and the burnings and the deliberate starvation of their schools, until the day when their students and their students' students finally had the tools and the numbers and the legal standing to demand that America live up to its own promises. Enter Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, and one of the most remarkable partnerships in American educational history. Rosenwald, a Jewish-American businessman who had become president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, met Washington, the famed educator who ran the Tuskegee Institute, around 1911. Washington showed Rosenwald the conditions black students faced in the rural South, not as a fundraising pitch, but as a plain statement of fact. Rosenwald was devastated by what he saw. The two men built a friendship rooted in a shared belief that education was the foundation of freedom, and from that friendship came the Rosenwald School Building Program. Starting in 1912 and running through 1932, the program helped build more than 5,300 schools, workshops, and teacher homes across 15 southern states. By 1928, 1 in 3 black children in the South was being educated in a Rosenwald school. The schools were architecturally distinctive, built according to standardized plans that specified everything from the orientation of the building, always facing north or south to maximize natural light through large windows, to the color of the interior walls, cream, eggshell to encourage calm and learning. They had wooden floors that glistened with linseed oil. They had proper chalkboards. They had desks. The Rosenwald Fund also recognized that buildings alone weren't enough. The program identified several chronic problems plaguing black education in the South: a lack of adequately paid and trained teachers, the absence of high schools for black students, and the fact that many black rural schools operated for only 4 months a year. The fund addressed these issues through multiple programs, building not just schoolhouses, but also teacher residences called teacherages, which provided housing for 3 to 5 teachers near the schools where they worked. This was crucial in rural areas where black teachers, often from cities or black colleges far away, had nowhere to live. Without housing, you couldn't keep a teacher. Without a teacher, the school was just a building. The teacherages solved that problem with characteristic practicality. The fund also built shop buildings where students practiced carpentry, metalwork, and other industrial skills. Booker T. Washington and other progressive-era thinkers believed that practical education was the most direct path out of poverty, and the shop buildings reflected that philosophy. This emphasis on industrial education was controversial then and remains debated now. Critics, including W.E.B. Du Bois and his allies, argued that channeling black students into manual trades rather than academic pursuits was a form of accommodation to white supremacy, a way of producing a skilled labor force without challenging the hierarchies that kept black people subordinate. Proponents, including Washington, argued that in the world as it actually existed, a black person with a trade could earn a living, build wealth, and create the economic foundation that would eventually support broader political and social change. The debate between these two visions of black education, one emphasizing classical, academic training and the other emphasizing practical vocational skills, ran through this entire period and shaped the institutions that emerged from it. What's remarkable is that black communities themselves often held both visions simultaneously. Parents wanted their children to learn to read Shakespeare, and they wanted them to learn to build a house. They wanted classical education and practical skills, academic training, and economic self-sufficiency. The communities that raised money for Rosenwald schools weren't choosing between uplift and survival. They were demanding both, because they understood that in America, you needed both to have any chance at all. But here's the detail that matters most. Rosenwald's fund provided seed money, not full funding. The model required matching contributions from black communities, white governing bodies, and public funds. In practice, this meant that black families, people who were already being double taxed, who were sharecropping on land they didn't own, who were scraping together pennies from a system designed to keep them poor, raised more than $4.7 million to build their own children's schools. They held fish fries. They passed collection plates. They donated land. They felled trees and sawed lumber and hammered nails. They built these schools with their own hands because no one else was going to do it for them. The schools worked. Research has shown that the Rosenwald program accounted for a significant portion of the educational gains among rural southern black people during this period. Students who attended Rosenwald schools completed more than a full additional year of education compared to those without access. The program improved literacy, increased attendance, boosted test scores, and even influenced patterns of northern migration. The students who walked through those doors went on to become teachers, ministers, nurses, business owners, and community leaders. John Lewis attended a Rosenwald school. Maya Angelou attended a Rosenwald school. Medgar Evers attended a Rosenwald school. The ripple effects lasted generations. On warm days at one Rosenwald school in Maryland, the Sharptown Colored School, 2 ancient oaks offered shade in the front yard, and out back, a softball field gave young black children a rare place in segregated Maryland to slide into home plate. On cold days, a pot-bellied stove heated the rooms. Light poured in from 2 walls of windows. The pine floors gleamed. Teachers lived nearby. It was a community. It was a family. And it was built, every board of it, on the backs of people who believed that their children deserved better than what the world was offering. One more detail about the Rosenwald schools that I want you to carry with you. When these schools were built, the fund published detailed plans called Community School Plans that specified every aspect of the construction. The buildings were oriented to maximize natural light, with large, double-hung windows on 2 walls so that sunlight filled the rooms throughout the day. The interior walls were painted cream or eggshell. The floors were pine, regularly oiled. The blackboards were large and properly mounted. The ceilings were high enough to allow air circulation. These weren't grand architectural statements. They were modest, practical buildings, but they were thoughtfully designed to create the best possible learning environment with limited resources. And for children who had been attending school in shacks with dirt floors and no windows, walking into a Rosenwald school for the first time must have felt like stepping into a different world. The care that went into these buildings communicated something that no textbook could. It said, "You matter. Your education matters. You deserve a place that was built with thought and intention and care. You deserve light and clean floors and proper desks." In a world that told black children in 1,000 ways, every single day, that they were less than, the Rosenwald School whispered something different. It whispered, "You are worth building for." And the communities that built these schools knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just constructing buildings, they were constructing futures. Every nail driven, every board cut, every dollar contributed was an investment in a generation that the builders might never see grow up. Sharecroppers who would never read a novel built schools so that their grandchildren might become novelists. Washerwomen who couldn't sign their own names raised money so that their granddaughters might become doctors. The time horizon of their investment was not months or years, but generations. And that long view, that willingness to sacrifice for a future they might never personally enjoy, is one of the most profound expressions of love and faith in the entire American story. The Rosenwald building program ended in 1932, when the Depression thinned the fund and Rosenwald himself died. But the schools kept operating, many of them serving black students for another 2 decades, until the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education declared segregation unconstitutional. After that, many Rosenwald schools were closed, consolidated, abandoned, or demolished. Of the original 5,357 structures, only about 500 survive today. Some have been restored as community centers and museums. Others sit empty, their big windows letting in the light and the weather, quiet monuments to what black communities built when nobody else would. Let's pause here and take stock of what we've covered tonight, because the timeline alone tells a story that defies belief. In 1860, maybe 5% of enslaved black people in the South were literate to any degree, and the act of teaching them was punishable by law in nearly every southern state. By 1870, just 10 years later, 250,000 black students were enrolled in schools across the South, learning to read, write, and cipher. By 1880, black literacy rates were climbing sharply. By the early 20th century, black communities had built thousands of their own schools, raised millions of their own dollars, and created a tradition of educational excellence that would produce some of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. In a single generation, a people who were legally defined as property became a people who were building their own schools, training their own teachers, writing their own newspapers, running their own businesses, and demanding their own rights. There is no comparable achievement in American history. There may be no comparable achievement in human history, and the legacy extends far beyond the schools themselves. The Freedmen Schools were the incubators of the black institutions that would shape American life for the next century and beyond. Hampton University, where Mary Peake taught under the Emancipation Oak, became one of the nation's premier historically black universities. Fisk University in Nashville, Howard University in Washington, Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. These institutions were all born from the same impulse that drove a sharecropper to put coins in a collection plate for a one-room schoolhouse in 1868. The same impulse that drove an enslaved woman to wrap a spelling book in cloth and carry it to a secret school in the woods. The thread is unbroken. From the Pitt schools to the Ivy League, from the Blueback Speller to the doctoral dissertation, the story is one continuous act of claiming what was owed. And it's a story that hasn't ended. The echoes of those first schools reverberate through every fight over school funding, every debate about educational equity, every parent who shows up at a school board meeting and refuses to be silenced. When you hear about communities today advocating for better schools, for fairer funding, for curricula that tell the full story of American history, you're hearing the same voice that spoke in 1866, in 1870, in 1920. The same hunger, the same refusal, the same belief that education is the foundation of everything else, and that no child should be denied it because of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Tonight you travel through something vast. You started in the dark, in secret schools held in the woods at midnight, where enslaved people risk whipping and worse for the chance to sound out letters by pine torch light. You walked through the explosive birth of black education after the war, when communities that had nothing built schools from nothing. You sat in those schools, felt the packed dirt floor under your feet, smelled the chalk dust and the sweat, heard the chorus of voices learning to read. You met the teachers, black and white, northern and southern, who faced arson and assault and social exile and kept teaching. You saw the schoolhouses burn and you saw them rise again. You followed the story through the betrayal of Reconstruction, through the systematic robbery of separate but equal, through the extraordinary determination of communities who raise millions of dollars from their own meager pockets to build something beautiful for their children. And here's what I want you to carry with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. The story of black education in America isn't a story about what was given. It's a story about what was taken and what was claimed back. Every school that black communities built was an act of defiance against a system that tried to define them as incapable. Every student who learned to read was living proof that the system was wrong. Every teacher who stood in front of a classroom, knowing that her life might be in danger for doing it, was making a bet on the future. A bet that said, what we build here will outlast what they burn. And they were right. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in your temperature-controlled room, with your phone on your nightstand, and the entire internet at your fingertips, whisper a quiet thank you. Not just a general thank you, but a specific one. Thank the woman who wrapped her spelling book in cloth and walked 5 miles to a one-room schoolhouse in 1866. Thank the man who lit a pine torch in the Alabama woods in 1850 and taught himself to read at the age of 45. Thank the teacher who was told her school had been burned to ashes and said, all right, we'll start again. Thank the sharecropper who put coins he couldn't afford into a collection plate so his granddaughter might one day sit in a building with real windows and a real floor and a real desk. They didn't do it for gratitude. They did it because they understood something that the people who oppressed them never could, that knowledge, once it enters a mind, can never be taken back. You can burn the building, you can ban the book, you can cut the finger, but once someone knows that the letters B-A-K-E-R spell baker, and the letters F-R-E-E spell free, that knowledge lives in them forever, and they'll pass it on to their children and to their children's children, and on, through generations, through Jim Crow and segregation and redlining and every new version of the same old attempt to keep people down. The first black schools in America weren't built on money or political power or institutional support. They were built on the most durable material in human history, the belief that learning matters, that it matters enough to die for, and that a people's hunger for knowledge is the one thing no system of oppression has ever figured out how to kill. Close your eyes now. Let the warmth of your bed hold you. And know that the ability you have to read, to think, to question, to know, didn't come from nowhere. It came from someone who fought for it in a way most of us will never have to. Rest well tonight. You've earned it. And so did they. Good night.